So we're going to have two chapters to cover tonight, perhaps. We don't cover both of them, that's fine. The second chapter sort of overlaps with this chapter, but it also sort of overlaps with chapter 10. So, we'll see what happens. Chapter 8 is the study of the historical Jesus. And the notion here, early on in the discipline, which is called historical Jesus, you have this distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. So the idea is, whatever your faith commitment is, that pertains to Christ. But when we're talking about historical character, we're talking about Jesus. And so that's why there's a study or a search for the historical Jesus. Our image here that I've given us is sort of a who was Jesus kind of thing. The left image is an early icon of Jesus, an early image of Jesus called Christ Pantocrator, and it's in the Sinai Peninsula at St. Catherine's Monastery, I believe. And then the image on the right here is a recent reconstruction of what Jesus may have looked like. And so we have sort of two different images of what Jesus may have looked like. So the notion of historical Jesus, why study this? From a Christian perspective, Jesus is the revelation of who God really is. And so the more that we can learn of him historically, we would, from a evangelical Christian perspective, we would think that the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith are aligned in some meaningful way. And so if we learn something of Jesus from a historical perspective, that should tell us something of the Christ of faith. So in addition to that, we should understand the Bible in light of the best knowledge we have about its world and its context. And so the more that we spend time trying to figure out what Jesus would have been like, the better that we will understand the Gospels and the New Testament and our faith. And then, as I've said before, Christians must not be afraid of truth. If Christianity is false, I would like to know now. If Christianity is true, then I don't have to be afraid of questions, right? So Jesus' identity is debated in the public square. It is worth noting that from an academic perspective, virtually no one debates his existence. Whether you're an atheist, agnostic, whatever your background is, virtually no one, there's really only one guy named Richard Carrier who has a PhD in ancient history and doesn't think that Jesus existed. And that's it. Anybody else who thinks that Jesus didn't exist is not a credible historian of the ancient world. There's just Richard Carrier. Everybody else, Ehrman included, right? We've talked about Bart Ehrman. He's agnostic or an atheist. Actually, I read a post of his the other day where he specifically stated that he's an atheist. So I suppose I can start saying he's an atheist since that he says that of himself. But even Ehrman, who's an atheist, would say it is virtually certain that Jesus existed. That we should be as confident of his existence as we are of any other ancient world character, right? And so in this topic, whether Jesus existed isn't really in debate, but who was he? What was he trying to do? Those sorts of things. They are absolutely in debate. And so Christians should be prepared to give a reasonable answer to any of the questions regarding that. Not too long ago, maybe 10 years ago or less, there's a guy named Reza Aslan, who is a popular author. He wrote a book called Zealot, where he was trying to paint Jesus as this revolutionary figure who's trying to lead a revolt. And it made a lot of press, right? He was on CNN, on probably not on Fox News, but MSNBC, etc. Talking about his book and talking about his perspective of who he thought Jesus was. And so those sorts of things come out. They particularly come out around Easter, right? Right around Easter, and sometimes around Christmas, who was Jesus and, that sort of stuff. So I did find a video for us that I think will be helpful, just to kind of give us an overview of what we're talking about when we talk about the quests for the historical Jesus. This is Mark Strauss. Mark Strauss is a New Testament scholar. I forget off the top of my head where he teaches. He teaches at Bethel Seminary, I'm not sure.
So how did we get to this point of questioning? The answer is what has been called the quest for the historical Jesus. Here we're going to briefly survey 4 phases of this quest. In the 18th and 19th century, what has been called the first quest for the historical Jesus sought to find a Jesus set free from the mythical worldview of the Bible. Drawing from philosophical rationalism that arose during the birth of science and the period of the Enlightenment, scholars tried to find a non-supernatural Jesus. Many of these scholars concluded that Jesus was a mere man, an ethical teacher, proclaiming the love of God and the brotherhood of all human beings. The miracles, they said, could be explained away from unrecognized causes or perhaps mistaken observations made by primitive peoples. The feeding of the 5,000, one scholar suggested, occurred when rich people were encouraged to share their own lunches by a little boy's unselfish example. Another scholar suggested that Jesus only appeared to be walking on the water, when in fact he was walking near the shore and there was a mist covering his feet. These are rationalistic attempts to explain the miracles of Jesus. Albert Schweitzer, in his classic book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, chronicled this first quest. He showed that these scholars were merely creating a Jesus in their own image. They transformed the historical Jesus into a modern philanthropist, preaching an inoffensive message of love and brotherhood. With Schweitzer's devastating critique, the first quest petered out. A second phase that followed this first quest has been identified as a period of no quest, or extreme skepticism concerning the historical Jesus. It's identified especially with Rudolf Bultmann, the leading German New Testament scholar of the 20th century. Many people and things influenced Bultmann's perspective. Let me just point to a few of these key influences. The first influence was David Friedrich Strauss, who in his book, The Life of Christ, critically examined, denied that we could find natural explanations for supernatural events in the Gospels. He argued instead that the miracle tradition as a whole represented myths and legends that developed over a long period of time. While before Strauss, the Gospel of Mark was considered to be a generally reliable historical account, Strauss claimed that it was mostly myth and legend created by the later church. If Strauss claimed the Gospels were overlaid with myths, William Rada sought to show that the Gospels were theologically motivated propaganda rather than historical narrative. He challenged the first quest assumption concerning the historicity of Mark's Gospel, claiming that Mark and others before him had created a motif he called the Messianic secret as a way to explain Jesus' essentially unmessianic life. The significance of Rada's work was that the Gospels were now increasingly viewed not as historical documents, but as apologetically motivated propaganda intended to promote the theology of the early church. If Strauss and Rada questioned the historicity of the Gospels, Johannes Weiss challenged the 19th century view of Jesus as an enlightened liberal social reformer. He sought to place Jesus' kingdom preaching in its first century context. In this context, Weiss said, the kingdom of God was understood as God's end-time intervention to dramatically judge the wicked and deliver the righteous. According to Weiss, Jesus was a wild-eyed apocalyptic prophet, expecting the soon end of the world. In his book, The So-Called Historical Jesus and the Historic Biblical Christ, published in 1892, Martin Kaler claimed that the quest of the historical Jesus was completely misguided and was doomed to failure. Kaler claimed that the so-called historical Jesus, reconstructed by the rationalists, was not the real Jesus at all, but a figment of scholarly imagination. The only real Jesus was the Christ of faith worshipped in the church. While Kaler's goal was to salvage the significance of Jesus for the church, in fact, he separated the historical Jesus from the church's Christ. We come now to Rudolf Bultmann's perspective, which was influeed by all of these people and others. Like Strauss, Bultmann claimed that the Gospels are filled with myths that arose in the context of the preaching of the early church. The earliest church had little interest in the historical Jesus. They were concerned only with the Christ of faith, who they worshipped in the present, rather than the Jesus of history shrouded in the mysteries of the past. Since the Christ of faith was still speaking to the church through the prophets, Bultmann said that the church had no problem placing the words of these prophets and teachers on the lips of Jesus. He assumed that the eyewitnesses played almost no role in passing down the traditions about Jesus. It followed from this that the origin of the gospel tradition must be found in the theological concerns of the early church, rather than in the life of the historical Jesus. From his perspective, the historical quest for Jesus was DOA, was dead on arrival. This period of no quest and Rudolf Bultmann gave way to a new or second quest. Some of Bultmann's students felt his skepticism had gone too far. And in the 1950s, they launched what has been called the new or second quest for the historical Jesus. It was sparked especially by a lecture given by Ernst Käsemann, one of Bultmann's students. Käsemann's claim was that since Jesus was in fact a historical figure, we should be able to discern something about his identity and his goals by looking at the historical evidence. While rejecting Bultmann's extreme skepticism, these scholars started with the same basic negative assumptions. These assumptions included rejection of the supernatural as impossible, the assumption that the Gospels are theological rather than historical documents, motivated theologically rather than to record accurate historical events. And third, the assumption that the Gospel writers were not eyewitnesses at all, but were far removed from Jesus in space and time. The result of this second quest was a minimalist perspective that did not go much beyond Bultmann's no-quest conclusions. While the second quest did not get very far, from the 1980s onward, a great deal of new research on Jesus has emerged. Some are calling this work a third quest for the historical Jesus. This quest has been sparked by advances in linguistics, archaeology, and the employment of new methodologies, such as socio-cultural methodologies, anthropological, rhetorical methodologies. New methods continue to appear. For example, one recent area of research has centered on social memory theory. How do communities remember and pass down authoritative tradition? And what can this tell us about the gospel tradition? Another methodology is called performance criticism, which examines the Gospels not so much as literary works, but as written records of oral performances in the early church. Because there is such enormous diversity among Jesus scholars today, it's probably inappropriate to speak of a single third quest. Instead, we should speak merely of an incredibly rich, diverse, and multifaceted historical Jesus research.
Strauss is a gospel scholar, and he's got a book called Four Portraits, One Jesus. That's a really great resource for studying the four gospels. That covers each of the gospels and then covers major themes in the gospels and that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure that this video is part of the lecture series that goes along with that book. And Zondervan provides lectures for a lot of their books, like Wright and Bird. You can actually get lectures from Wright and Bird from Zondervan for the book that we're using.
In that book, so how much? Where does he stand on historical Jesus in terms of that book on the study of the Gospels? Does he give you sort of an overview?
So his historical Jesus chapter,
theological differences.
His historical Jesus chapter is going to do what he just did in the video, and then continue on to sort of mount a case for what we can know about Jesus historically. So he would land in what he's calling, or saying we shouldn't call, the third quest, right? He's sort of looking back on all of those quests and kind of critiquing them and saying we can know things about Jesus historically, and we should believe that they're meaningfully aligned with the Christ of faith, right? And that's typically where most evangelicals working on historical Jesus fall, is somewhere in the third quest. That which I'll unpack the third quest just a little bit more in just a second. Kind of some of the generally defining kind of tit post for it. So it's worth noting here that one of the suggested videos is Richard Carrier, Was Jesus Real? That's the one guy that thinks that Jesus didn't exist. Everybody else, regardless of faith commitment. Now, there are definitely atheists who will say that Jesus didn't exist, but the atheists that say that aren't historians. They're atheists that just want to say Jesus didn't exist, right? There's not a, it's not like they've actually done their homework so they can actually say that with any kind of authority. So
I'm not sure I understand folks that are talking about first the early church's motivations for creating of Jesus.
yeah,
Out of what?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
motivation?
Right, right.
What being? Of what teaching?
right,
Where?
right.
I mean, it's like the early
Right,
church. What is that?
right,
Are they
right.
geniuses that create?
right.
Hey, we gotta create some kind of monotheistic
Right.
Messiah. I'm
Right.
kind of confused.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think there's a reason for that, right? Like that is it's a very confusing approach to things, and honestly, Ehrman is very influenced by those people, and so what Ehrman will do to resolve that very problem is he'll say there is no such thing as early Christianity. There's early Christianities, and so the Gospels that we have are just the people that won. But all of the other Gospels, right, those are all of the other communities and all of their versions of who Jesus was. And so Ehrman is addressing that very question of like, well, what do you even mean that these communities were inventing Jesus? And Ehrman's like, yeah, everybody did. And we only look at the version that we like, right? We don't look at all of the other versions. But yeah, it's from a historical perspective, it's a little. I mean, it's like he was saying, they're very. Well, if you apply the criteria that they apply to Jesus to virtually anything else in history, we wouldn't know anything.
Well, exactly.
Right? You apply the criteria that they apply to Jesus to what I ate for dinner, and
The problem is it's fraught with all the theological.
Right.
That's why people still are scared.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Was it Crossan? They got drunk. Did he get drunk out of the Catholic Church or did he leave on something like that? But he was one of the
Right. He's one of the Jesus
seminar guys,
Yeah.
and there were people that freaked out about that.
Yep.
Sort of thing. I don't like.
Yep.
No.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So notably in the first quest, I mean, we don't have to go through each of these points, but I think the most notable moment in the first quest is there with Boltmann there at the end. What we know about the historical Jesus could fit on a 4x6 index card, and that's just ludicrous, right? That's such a reductionist perspective on what we can know about Jesus historically, that if you apply that to just literally anything else in history, we don't know anything, but Jesus is special, so we're going to apply special criteria to what we know about him. And in the no quest, this is where we get the dichotomy of the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history. And this is really championed by Karl Barth, where he's basically saying, like, just give up on the whole historical thing. Just focus on, who is the Christ of faith? What can we know of Christ in our faith? Let's not worry about the historical details. Let's just focus on Christ of faith, right? So let's give up this whole process. And then the second quest, this is where the Jesus seminar comes in. And again, this is really skeptical of everything that Jesus says. The Jesus seminar, they get together and vote. They have a system of colored beads where they have sayings of Jesus, and they place a colored bead with that saying, and based on the preponderance of the color of all of the beads for that saying, they determine whether or not that saying was likely by Jesus or not likely by Jesus or maybe by Jesus or that sort of thing. It's a little mind-boggling because the Jesus seminar, not all of the people that are in it are actually like historians or scholars of the New Testament. yeah, you have some just random dudes that show up that are like, I don't think Jesus said that. And you're like, I don't know that your opinion should count as much as, you know, Marcus Borg or John Dominic Crossan or, you know, like you're just some random guy, you know. I think they're like, famously, I think there was a journalist who was a part of the Jesus seminar, no training whatsoever in history, no training, you know, just journalist. And so like he came in and was like, Jesus didn't say that, Jesus didn't say that, Jesus didn't say that. Then the third quest, this is E.P. Sanders is probably the biggest name in the third quest, apart from James D.G. Dunn and N.T. Wright. But E.P. Sanders' Paul and Palestinian Judaism is his book on this. It really kicks off the third quest. And the big commonality here in the third quest is what we've already sort of started to do, which is kind of the cultural background of the New Testament, is that they're trying in the third quest not to be sort of this like reductive enlightenment project of like, how skeptical can we be, but rather, what can we know of first century Judaism, first century Palestine? How can we understand the Gospels in light of that? How can we understand our historical sources in light of that? And you know, we should interpret it accordingly. And to be fair to Ehrman, I mean, Ehrman isn't entirely a Bultmannian. He engages in this as well. You know, because any legitimate scholar of the New Testament right now is going to recognize the importance of, you know, Second Temple Judaism and cultural background for the New Testament, that kind of stuff. And so Ehrman does recognize that, but he also sort of is still kind of smuggling in some of that second quest, first quest skepticism.
So these folks would take into account like archaeological finds and the agricultural economy and to understand.
Yeah, social science criticism, like we looked at with the honor shame stuff. They think about that kind of stuff. Yeah, all of that. Basically, anything that you can think of that might give us a look into what life was like for someone in the first century, they're going to look at that and try to see how can this help me understand our historical data for Jesus or historical data for the Gospels or the disciples or, you know, whoever. So John P. Meyer lists these gains from the third quest. One of the nice things about the third quest, contra the first and second, is that it is ecumenical, interdenominational, meaning that you have atheists, you have evangelicals, you have Catholics, you have Orthodox, you have, I mean, virtually anybody who might be slightly interested in Jesus is involved in this. And so that is unique in contrast to previous quests for historical Jesus, because they tended to be sort of isolated just to the skeptics. We end up with re-examination of various texts, which is helpful. There's things that we thought it meant one thing, you know, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. And in light of the social science stuff, we start to see like, oh, we didn't quite understand that, right? We didn't understand what was meant there, right? And this is like in the video that we watched, when he was talking about Jesus in the synagogue, when Jesus responds with the two insults, nobody understood that, right? Until we started looking at it from a cultural perspective, and we're like, oh, they insulted him, and so he's responding in kind, right? Insights from archaeology, philology, sociology, all of that stuff has been very, very helpful. Gives us a more accurate picture of the diverse, variegated nature of Palestinian Judaism. Palestinian Judaism is remarkably diverse. We've talked about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Sicarii, but even that isn't even painting a picture that's diverse enough for us to appreciate what it was like in first century Judaism. And then clarification of criteria for historicity has really helped out a lot, because ancient history they're not interested in the same stuff. They're not interested in the same kind of details as we are. They're trying to do something else, which isn't to say they're not trying to do history. It's just saying that their definition of history is not ours. Yeah. And to a certain extent, we do some of the same stuff that they did, right? We have some of the same like summarization where, you'll like glaze over some of the details, and you wouldn't say omitting those details would make your story inaccurate. But generally speaking, our perspective on history is I want all of the details, whereas their perspective on history is there are a few major points I want to make, and that's all I'm really interested in doing. Everything that supports that point, I don't really care how that works. I might move things around to show a thematic purpose or something like that. So this results in a more positive treatment of miracle traditions in the gospel as well, not just because of the historicity, but also just in general, like looking at the way that people approached things in the first century, like they weren't stupid. If you say that Jesus didn't walk on the water, he just had mist covering his feet, you're kind of assuming that the disciples were sort of idiots, right? Like, because they're on this body of water all of the time. So don't you think they would know where the water ended? And, if they saw mist near his feet, don't you think they would maybe not think he was on water immediately? Like that's just such a, yeah. And then also taking the Jewishness of Jesus serious is a big deal for this, because prior to this, there's a lot of Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism meaning the Judaism that exists in between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So when we talked about the Hasmonean period and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and all of that stuff, that's Second Temple period. And Judaism in that period shifts pretty substantially. And there's some things that we just weren't appreciating fully that are necessary for understanding not just Jesus, but the New Testament in general. When Paul says in Corinthians that the rock that Israel drank from was Christ, right? If you remember that passage in Corinthians, I forget exactly where it's at, but he says that there's a rock that follows Israel through the desert, and that rock that they drank from was Christ. Well, there's nothing in the Old Testament that says the rock followed them. The Old Testament just says that they got water from a rock on a couple of different occasions. Well, there's a Second Temple interpretation that says since they got water from a rock on multiple occasions, that it was the same rock. And Paul takes that interpretation and just authorizes it. And prior to finding that stuff from Second Temple Judaism, we were just like, Paul, why are you saying that? Right? That just seems like an odd thing to assert, that the rock was Christ and that it followed them through the wilderness, right? But then you find that, oh, wow, there's actually like a reason for him to say that, because there's an interpretive tradition that indicates that that's actually what it was. Regarding the Jesus Seminar, it's worth noting that the expert commentary for the popular press, most genuine scholars of all viewpoints reject Jesus Seminar conclusions. Luke Timothy Johnson, who's a Catholic scholar who works at Emory University, says that they are self-selected, not on the grounds of quality scholarship, but on its members' prior commitment to a radical liberal viewpoint. The Jesus Seminar and its friends do not reflect any consensus of scholars except for those on the radical fringe of the field. Its methodology is seriously flawed and its conclusions unnecessarily skeptical. And so this would be another example of, in the third quest, you sort of have this ecumenical approach where everyone is coming to the table, whereas in the Jesus Seminar, it's sort of, we all agree, so let's get together and talk about what we agree about, right? And then they, point fingers at the people who have a faith commitment and say, well, you're just reading into the text, right? And you guys literally put a group together that agreed before the point, right? So who are you to cast stones regarding this, right? Kind of a crazy thing. So some of the sources that you can look at if you're interested in reading scholarly works on this. Ehrman has written a bunch on Historical Jesus. Misquoting Jesus is a very popular level book. How Jesus Became God is another popular level. Lost Scriptures and Lost Christianities are more scholarly. They're published by Oxford University Press. And so they're a little bit more of an academic level. But all of these are dealing with sort of historical Jesus kind of stuff. Lost Scriptures and Lost Christianities are taking on that notion of what are these other gospels and who produced these other gospels and what did they believe and why did they produce them and that sort of thing. We mentioned John Dominic Crossan earlier. He's got a gigantic book called The Historical Jesus that is really important work on this, regardless of what you believe about his scholarship. He's definitely on the liberal side of things. Larry Hurtado, who unfortunately has very recently passed away, he is phenomenal scholar on historical Jesus. I think he professor of New Testament at Aberdeen or Edinburgh, one of those major universities in the UK. I can't remember exactly which one it was. But he has a blog. You can go to larryhurtado.com or larryhurtado.net, I think. And he has blog posts about historical Jesus. If you just Google Larry Hurtado, I'm sure that his blog will come up. And he has like scholarly footnoted blog posts, right? It's just bizarre, but it's just really quality information. And then he's got these books, right? How on earth did Jesus become a God? Lord Jesus Christ, devotion to Jesus and earliest Christianity. And so he's going right at the same stuff that Ehrman's going at. And so that's really helpful. At a popular level, Gary Habermas and Mike Kona, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. This is probably one of the best works at sort of the popular level to help out with thinking through this stuff. And then Craig Keener, The Historical Jesus of the Gospels. Craig Keener is a machine. That guy is ridiculous. This book, the end notes in this book are longer than the book. And that is not an exaggeration. The book itself, I think, is like 375 pages, and the end notes, I think, are 400 pages. It's ridiculous. This guy is just, he's not human. Just the amount of information that he has at his command. I've met him and spoken to him a few times. We're sort of friends in a sense. I can like send him a message and he'll respond. And he's the conversations that I've had with him, just the stuff that he just knows off the top of his head, that it's ridiculous. He's crazy. And then N.T. Wright and Michael Bird, who are the authors of our text, both of them have done work on historical Jesus. So anything that they've written on that, on historical Jesus would obviously be good. And they make reference to it in their, in the book that we're reading. So you can check that out if you're interested. Regarding Ehrman and what Ehrman has to say about historical Jesus, Nicholas Perrin, who's another scholar that's worth looking at, he teaches at Wheaton. He said, and Ehrman went to Wheaton. He says that there are really only three responses to what Ehrman has to say about what we know about Jesus and what we know about the Gospels. And that's that concede the force of his arguments, offer a counter, or ignore the whole thing and hope it goes away. And you can guess where the church is firmly situated on this. Typically, the church is sort of firmly situated and ignore the whole thing and hope it goes away. Yet, we have legitimate answers to scholarly statements about what we know about Jesus, right? We have good reasons, good historical reasons to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so these works that that I've recommended already are good resources for that sort of thing. So let's talk about like kind of the nuts and bolts of this instead of just looking at what other people have done. Let's talk a little bit about what can we know about Jesus historically. And so talking about what we need for historical knowledge, Craig Keener in that book that I mentioned, the footnotes or the end notes are longer than the book. He says, we lack historical evidence for most of what has happened in history. And yet no one claims that nothing happened except what we can demonstrate by historical standards. Right? And so, we have to try to be even-handed with the way that we approach our requirements for historical events. So Habermas and Lacona, in that book that I recommended, they give us 5 principles, and these aren't, the authoritative 5 principles, but these are the principles that they use regarding what Jesus does in the Gospels, and specifically with regard to the resurrection of Jesus. So what they say is we need multiple independent sources in support of what we're talking about. Helps a whole lot to get an attestation by an enemy, because if everybody that talks about this particular event is all kind of on the same page, then it could have just been a conspiracy. If you have somebody that hates you saying that it happened, it's a different thing entirely. We should have embarrassing admissions. We have things that people wouldn't normally volunteer. Then there's a good chance that that's legit, because you probably aren't going to fabricate something that's embarrassing, right? Eyewitness testimony, obviously, is really helpful. And this is, one of the things that Ehrman's going to go after. Ehrman's going to say that the Gospels aren't eyewitness testimony. But he's doing that because of the influence of Bultmann. Right? He's doing that because of the influence of First and Second Quests of historical Jesus. There's not really any good reason to say that the Gospels aren't eyewitness testimony. They're not. The Gospels don't come out right and tell us, right, I was there, my name was Matthew, an eyewitness. But there are lots of things that happen in the Gospels that just don't make sense if there's not eyewitnesses, right? My favorite example would be in Luke, when, in the beginning of Luke, when it's talking about Mary and the angel visits Mary, there's a point in the story where it says, she treasured these things in her heart, right? How on earth would you know that? Now, it's entirely possible that it's fabricated, right? He could fabricate that. But if Mary exists, if Mary is a real person, and you're going to write that in your gospel, one would think, if you fabricated that, at some point, Mary might say, hey, what are you talking about with that? Right? What did you mean by that? Right? So instead, it seems more likely that Luke is actually interviewing Mary there, right? Mm-hmm. Also, early testimony, and the Gospels give us that. The Gospels absolutely give us early testimony with regard to historical standards, right? And so we also should think about what sources should we use. Should we use Christian sources like the Gospels? Should we use secular sources? Should we use heretical sources like what Ehrman is talking about with lost Christianities and lost scriptures? For example, and this is, you don't necessarily have to approach it this way, but Habermas tells us that within 150 years of Jesus' life, we have 17 secular sources that tell us about Jesus. And this is in that book, The Case for the Resurrection by Habermas and Lacona. He goes through these sources and where you can find them and what they say, that sort of thing. The 17 secular sources. So we can wipe the Gospels out, wipe out all of the Christian sources, working just off of secular sources. We have 17 sources within 150 years of his life. That's pretty good from a historical perspective. I mean, this is why when someone like Richard Carrier says Jesus didn't exist, credible historians laugh at him, right? Because you have 17 sources within 150 years of someone's life. That's pretty reliable. Right, yeah, the 4x6 index card, exactly. And so, I mean, this isn't exact math here with 150 years ago. I'm reusing this slide that's 10, 15 years old. But, if we think about the Civil War, right, can we know anything reliably about the Civil War? And that's a reasonable question, right? Did it happen? We can actually know things about the Civil War, and we're dealing with roughly the same time period. If we go back to the ancient world, if we look at somebody like Alexander the Great, he dies in 330 BCE. And he has plenty of contemporaries writing about him, but we don't have any of those sources. So we know that they were written, but we don't have any of them. Our earliest source about Alexander the Great is 300 years after he died. And yet we consider that reliable, that we can trust something 300 years after he died. Our best sources are Plutarch and Arian. Both of them wrote 400 to 450 years after he died. That's crazy, right? And I mean, sharp contrast to that, 150 years after Jesus, we have 17 secular sources about him. And so nobody debates the existence of Alexander the Great or any of the events in his life. Everybody debates the existence of Jesus and events in his life. Now, I mean, we do have to be fair here. Alexander the Great, none of the people who are accepting what we know about him are accepting him as their personal Lord and Savior, right? On the basis of this historical evidence. So we do want to be fair that it isn't just like we have sources for Jesus, therefore be a Christian, right? That isn't how it works. But we have sources for Jesus, so therefore we should have a conversation about this, right?
Well, because they can't separate the fact that there's a historical quest for a human being that lived 2,000 years ago. You just have to step aside and say,
Yeah.
Not the Christ, this person, let's get at what we can
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And it's bothersome that scholars clearly, they never admit it, can't separate that out.
Right.
Because of what you're saying right here.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a double standard, right? It's special pleading, right? You have you really don't want to believe things about Jesus, and so you raise the bar for the evidence that you need in order to believe anything about him. And again, like I said, it's not we have to be careful about this because there's definitely people who engage in apologetics who use this kind of stuff and say, see, we should believe everything that the Gospels say about Jesus. And we're like, well, it doesn't follow, right? Like, that isn't proper argumentation. But we should believe that Jesus existed. We should pay attention to these sources, that sort of thing. Another example of this, appropriate to the time, Tiberius. 4 major sources about him. We have a contemporary source, but it tells us almost nothing. We have Tacitus, who writes about 100 years later. Suetonius, who writes about 100 years later. We have Dio Cassius, who writes in the 3rd century. 4 sources between contemporary and a couple hundred years later. And this is all we have for him, and he's a Roman emperor at the same time as Jesus, right? So we have more information about Jesus from the same time period than we do about Tiberius. That's just insane, right? So from a historical standpoint, we should absolutely trust that Jesus existed, and we should absolutely trust a lot of the things about him. Now, whether or not that results in we should therefore be Christians, whole other conversation. We should definitely believe he existed and believe several things about him. Yeah.
All right, so something about these references of what makes these references work. You can't tell me this
Oh, right. So, yeah, it's not to say that like the statue doesn't exist. It's to say that there aren't like written records about him telling us like, here's who he was and here is how he lived or here's what he did or that sort of thing.
Okay, so like the decrees, for example, signed by him on the way. I'm sure some of those probably exist.
Not really. Yeah, these are the sources that we have for him. Yeah. Yeah, ancient history, I mean, it gets dicey.
Yeah, I know about the oral tradition of the canon system that was built.
Right. Yeah.
So you're missing a lot of the clues we look for in the modern.
Yeah.
It's kind of surprising me. There's like
Nothing.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, and there's likely material evidence of his existence, like inscriptions or coins, stuff like that, but they don't tell us anything about him. They just tell us that he existed, right? This is like, what sort of like documentation do we have about him existing and what he was like and what he did and that sort of thing, right? Right, yeah, any quotations from him or anything like that. Yeah, all of the Roman emperors were very fond of minting coins with their images on them and making statues and all that sort of stuff. But that doesn't give us much content about who they are beyond they were, right? That sort of thing. So, yeah, so the 17 sources, from those 17 sources, we can get 60 things about Jesus. 12 of the 17 mention that he died. Ehrman will go on record as saying that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the most certain events in all of history. That to argue that Jesus did not die by crucifixion is almost as ridiculous as arguing that he didn't exist. So Jesus' death by crucifixion is virtually certain. 6 of them mention him as deity, but these are secular sources, and so you have to recognize that they're not saying he is God, they're saying his believers believe he's God, right? Which is still important because you're going to have people saying that the early Christians made up accounts about Jesus, and some of them didn't believe he was God, or no one believed he was, and so these sources tell us that they believe that he was God.
What kind of secular sources are these?
So, brings me to my next point. So here are some of the sources, right? Livy, Pliny, Trajan, Lucian, Josephus. The passage in Josephus is debated, but at the very least, the passage in Josephus has to, at the very least, it mentions that Jesus existed and that he was killed by crucifixion. There's an addition to that may or may not be original that talks about him resurrecting and being the Messiah, which is, that addition is probably not legitimate, but the original, basically what happened is somebody probably, after Josephus wrote about Jesus dying by crucifixion, someone later made a copy of it, and some Christian in making a copy of it added in, and then he was resurrected because he was the Messiah, right?
It's timely somewhere.
Yeah, just, you missed the part.
It's a good email.
Yeah, exactly.
It explains that in the book.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, and so these are just 5 of the 17. They're just examples. But like I said, the Habermas and Lacona's book do a good job of pointing to other sources. And Keener is, there's a reason that his indents are longer than the book, because he gives you lengthy quotations about all of these various sources. My favorite one, and I don't remember if I've shared this with you guys or not, but because I share it all the time because it's my favorite quote about the historical Jesus, is Pliny the Younger, who's a Roman governor in Turkey around 112. He writes to Trajan, and in his letter he says that Christians gather each week on a particular day and they sing hymns to Christ as to a God. And so he basically says, what am I supposed to do with these people because they refuse to worship the emperor, or you rather, he's talking to Trajan. And so they refuse to worship you, and so what do I do with them? He then goes on to say, some of them will recant, and then he specifically says, those who are truly Christians refuse. They refuse to repent, they refuse to curse Jesus. Even when I threaten to kill them, they refuse. And it's just really interesting that you have Pliny who is saying those who are really Christians, right? Like he's making that distinction. It's just really interesting, right? And so Trajan responds, and I thought I had the point about Trajan response, but he responds and basically says, don't go out of your way. But yeah, if you run into them and they refuse, then yeah, you got to kill them, and so you actually have a Roman emperor talking about Jesus and Christ followers within 100 years of the cross, which I think is pretty fascinating, right? That we have a Roman governor and a Roman emperor talking about how to deal with these Christians less than 100 years from the cross. So Habermas and Lacona go on to talk about, man, that font is tiny. Wow. Jeez, that's tiny. Sorry.
What's the source? Which one?
This is Habermas and Lacona. And so there are 12 historical facts about Jesus. They go on to reduce it to 5, which they call their minimal facts. The 12 facts are Jesus died by crucifixion, Virtually everybody accepts that. He was buried. Virtually everybody accepts that. Death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. Virtually everybody accepts that. The tomb was empty. That is hotly contested, right? What was going on with the tomb? That's contested. But we have in Matthew an early account of the disciples stole the body. And if the tomb wasn't empty, then why would they ever say that the disciples stole the body? Disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. So this is a big deal. This results in them being transformed from having despair and losing hope, right, to bold proclaimers of the gospel. The resurrection was central to all of this. That's what changed everything. They preached the message of Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem. The church was born and grew. Orthodox Jews, this is a huge one, honestly, in my opinion. Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their primary day of worship. For an Orthodox Jew to abandon their ancestral day of worship is huge. Something pretty dramatic has to happen for them to decide, I'm not going to worship on Sabbath, I'm going to worship on Sunday. And they're worshiping on Sunday to celebrate the resurrection. That's when Jesus rose from the dead. And so there's a great book on this by D.A. Carson called Sabbath to Lord's Day, where he talks about that shift and how important that shift was. James was converted to the faith when he saw the resurrected Jesus. He's a family skeptic. And then Paul was converted to the faith, and Paul was an outsider skeptic. And so Lacona and Habermas put out these 12 facts and say, we can pretty well establish all of these facts, or at the very least, most of these facts. And if you have these facts, you really, really should be a Christian. You really have to accept Christianity. If these are all true, particularly empty tomb and resurrection, right? The minimal facts, this is sort of their elevator pitch, right? Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples believed that he rose and appeared, and Paul is suddenly changed. James is suddenly changed, and the empty tomb. And I think, a lot of times we don't give as much weight to Paul and James as we ought to. Paul is killing Christians. For him to change his perspective on Christianity is going to take something pretty dramatic. And then James, not to be indelicate here, but what would it take for you to call your sibling God, right? That's a pretty...
I don't know that story in the change.
I'm sorry?
Is there a moment? I don't know the same story.
There's not... In the New Testament, we don't have a record of it happening. We just have the Epistle of James, where by the time you get to the Epistle of James, he's now a believer in Jesus. So we don't have, and then in Acts, he's a leader of the church. But we don't have this conversion story explained. And so all we have is in the Gospels, while Jesus is alive, his family seems to doubt him and kind of not know why he's doing what he's doing. And then fast forward to Acts, and James is a pillar of the church, right? And so it seems like what happens here to motivate James to, switch from what's my brother doing to, yeah, he's God, right? That's a pretty dramatic shift to do that, right? And then one other thing regarding historical Jesus, to talk about Paul briefly, just because some elements of Paul help us with regard to understanding what's happening in Jesus' life and what we can know about Jesus' life. Pretty much everybody concedes that Paul existed. He's Pharisee training under Gamaliel. Gamaliel is a grandson of Hillel, which is very important because Hillel is one of the most important rabbis in Jewish history. So, for instance, there's, I think there's one here at Tech, the Hillel Student Center, right? That's named after that Hillel, right? He's that important. So he's incredibly important, and Paul studies under his grandson. So Paul is getting the best of the best of the best education, right? He's sort of the theological grandson of one of the most important rabbis in Jewish history. New Testament includes 12 books by him, 6 to 7 of which are broadly accepted. One of these is 1 Corinthians 15, which is probably the earliest thing written in the New Testament, is I gave you what I was given. And then what he was given is likely a creed that goes all the way back to about the time of the cross. And so he gives us this, that Jesus was crucified according to the scriptures, was buried according to the scriptures, was raised according to the scriptures, right? So if Paul gives this before writing the letter, right, I gave you, speaking in past tense, then that pushes the date of giving it back, right? And we know that Paul was in Corinth in 51 AD, because the city-state ruler mentioned there, Gallio, only ruled Corinth for a year. We know that historically. Peter and James are in Jerusalem around 35, so the timeline working backward is Paul delivers this creed to Corinth, to the Corinthian church in 51, because that's when he's there. We know that that's when he's there. He gives them that, and later references it in 1 Corinthians 15. So he gives it to them in 15. He verifies it 14 years after his initial conversion, which can't have been later than 37, because 51 minus 14 is 37. And we get that 14 from Galatians chapter 1. And so if you look at Galatians chapter 1, he talks about going away and confirming this, right? Talks about his conversion and how he goes to talk to Peter and James and all that kind of stuff. His initial conversion was 3 years after, or his initial conversation was 3 years after his conversion, which then can't have been later than 34. So the two most legitimate dates for the crucifixion are either 30 AD or 33. So at the very most, we're 4 years from the crucifixion regarding this thing that Paul receives. So within 4 years of the crucifixion, Paul is receiving from Peter and James that Jesus died according to the scriptures, was buried according to the scriptures, and was raised according to the scriptures. And then there's this creedal formula. And James D.G. Dunn, who I mentioned before, who's a big influence on N.T. Wright and important thinker in Pauline studies in general and historical Jesus and all that stuff. He said that we can trace this back. I forget exactly how he does it, but in one of his works on this, it says we could trace this all the way back to 18 months from the cross. That the creed that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 15 is 18 months from the cross. And if you have that creed within 18 months, I mean, how long does it take to develop a creed? Right? To develop something that's sort of got that pithy quality, that's sort of rhythmic and memorable. It takes some time for that to happen. And so, getting pretty early here. Historically speaking, I mean, this to me, this bit is probably one of the more persuasive pieces of evidence regarding why we should believe that the resurrection actually happened. Because if you're getting back within 4 years, it's awfully hard to get a conspiracy going in 4 years. And if Dunn is right with 18 months, I mean that's dang near impossible, right? To get that level of a conspiracy within 18 months, that's ridiculous. So that's sort of a survey, right? Just kind of like a shotgun of historical Jesus. There's obviously like tons more to do with this that you can explore with regard to early writings that pertain to Jesus as a historical character. So, yeah. Any questions about any of this?
On the flip side, 180 from airmen and atheists. So the folks that fear a study of Jesus the human, well, those who believe he's divine, wasn't human. I mean, how does that all fit in, do you think? I'm sure there is fear to look at some humanity of Jesus when you believe he's divine.
Right.
And only divine.
Right.
So, do they have a voice in any of this, or are they just over here in houses of worship and don't even look at any of this.
Yeah. I mean, there's some early Christians who have what's called a prosthetic view of Jesus, which is that he appeared to be human, but not really. And so there is that sort of trend in early Christianity where there are some people who so emphasize his divinity that his humanity sort of washes away. But as far as modern people, in my experience, whether it's this topic or another topic, there are a whole lot of Christians who are, there's a philosopher named William Lane Craig who says that most of evangelicalism is coasting in intellectual neutral. And I think that there's some accuracy there, right? That we're sort of afraid that if we dig, we might find out that it's not true, you know? And so if you start getting into this stuff, you're going to find something that you can't reconcile, and then you're not really Christian anymore, which is ultimately what Ehrman did, right? Ehrman was a fundamentalist, and when he got to Princeton Theological Seminary, studying with Bruce Metzger, there's a passage in Mark where the Pharisees tell Jesus, why are your disciples picking off the heads of the grain and eating it on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, well, don't you know the story of when Abiathar was the high priest, David and his friends went in and ate the consecrated bread? Well, if you go back to the Old Testament, when they did that, Abiathar wasn't the high priest. And so Ehrman is writing a paper in seminary on that passage and is trying to explain why Jesus would say Abiathar was the high priest, even though he wasn't. And he's coming up with this really like fanciful explanation that is like pages and pages and pages and pages long. And Metzger wrote in the margin, maybe Mark just got it wrong. And that was one of the main things leading to Ehrman not being a Christian anymore, because he just didn't have a framework that allowed for Mark getting it wrong. He just couldn't, there wasn't a way for him to think through that. And that's he tells that story. He's like, I was a fundamentalist and I had no room for that, right? Now, I don't think Mark got it wrong. I think something else is happening there, because there are places in the Old Testament where they'll refer to a section by a specific event or by a specific person. And I think Jesus is referring to a section by Abiathar, not referring to Abiathar specifically being high priest in that event. Because they didn't have verse numbers or chapter numbers. So it's not like he could say, in 1 Samuel 16, right, like, that isn't a thing. So you have to have some sort of shorthand that allows you to say where things are. Now, I could be wrong about that, but yeah.
So throwing away everything because someone who's recording historical events, let's say he was wrong.
Yeah.
He heard it wrong, wrote it wrong.
Right.
Then that led him to assume that if this
one
one
thing's
thing's
wrong,
then why can't everything be wrong?
Yeah. And I mean, he's ultimately, he's still a fundamentalist. He's just a fundamentalist atheist, right? He's still a very all or nothing person. He's just all or nothing for a different worldview, right? And it's just unfortunate. I mean, he's a really brilliant guy. He just doesn't have the flexibility in his worldview to allow for, I'm not sure, you know.
So the secular scholars do a thing to sort of pick and choose which parts of the gospel they think are historically accurate, or do they believe the whole thing is just something you can't rely on? Or
it depends. Depends on who you're talking to. You know, Ehrman would say that a lot of the Gospels would be historically accurate, like a lot of what Jesus says, Jesus probably actually said. And then other New Testament scholars who are agnostic atheists or, any other kind of faith commitment, there's diversity there, right? And there are Christians that do the same thing. There are Christian scholars that, do the exact same thing, right? So, I don't know that there's like a specific division there. So, Cool. Other questions or thoughts or?
That's awesome. I've never seen that before. That's really.
The timeline for Paul.
Yeah. The way they brought it back.
Yeah. And this is all Habermas, right? This is how I've heard him give this talk a bunch. He has a lecture online called the Historical Jesus that trying to remember what website it's on. I think it's on Credo Courses. This is one of those websites that you should follow if you're interested in this kind of stuff. They're stop my share there and they have a bunch of courses that are available, and the courses regularly go on sale. So, you can spend money, right? You can spend the $200 here or whatever, but if you follow them, there's usually always something on here for free. Yeah, here we go. And it's free right now. Seminar on the Resurrection, Gary Habermas. So, yeah, and you can get the video and the audio for free right now. And so, yeah, this is a 2-hour seminar on Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas, and you can download it for free. And it's fantastic. I don't know if this is the exact one that I've heard, but I've heard him give those talks several times, and he's fantastic. Not only is he a wonderful scholar, he's just a great person. I met him at a conference one time, and he's just such a humble, kind person. He's fantastic. He talks, well, I'm not going to ruin it because it might be in this talk, so I won't tell the story, but he's great. He's great. So, and this is just Credo Courses. If you just Google Credo Courses, they run sales every couple of weeks or something. Something will be free or something will be $5 or something like that. And so I don't think I've ever actually paid money for any of their courses. I just wait. And they always do something on the resurrection. He has a full course on the resurrection that's like 30 hours of lecture on all of the different, here are all the different various theories for what could have happened other than a resurrection. And here's why all of them fail, right? And all of this other kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. And always, every year at Easter, they put that course for free, the 30 hours or whatever of him talking about the resurrection. That's just fantastic. Yeah. And he actually teaches at Liberty. So I'm not a huge fan of Liberty, but he's tenured professor at Liberty. And so he's not far from here. So we should have him come talk sometime. So, yeah. Cool. Other thoughts, questions, or anything? Doing good?